Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. Welcome to episode 83 of the Christian Women Leadership Podcast. Today, I'm talking with my co-host, Holly, and our guest, September, or Tembi Secrist. In this episode, you're going to hear about Tembi's incredible journey of stepping out into the unknown. She shares about the moment when God shifted her path from a very successful career in the U.S. government into something completely different, a 14-month trip through 22 countries in Southeast Asia and Africa. During that time, she volunteered her professional expertise with 45 NGOs and mission-based projects. I cannot wait for you to hear her stories and the lessons she shares. And if you listened to episode 82 last week, you know that I talked about the shifts that you need to make as a leader. And Tembi definitely shifted in a big way in order to follow God's leading in her life. So in this episode, you're going to hear about her leadership lessons that she learned on the trip and some of the incredible ways that God showed His faithfulness to her. Now, this is the first time we've ever done this, but we're actually splitting her episode into two parts. Our conversation with Tembi was so incredible, but it was quite long, and we did not want to cut anything out. So we are splitting this into two episodes, one this week and then one next week. So in today's episode, you're going to hear the first part of her journey and her first few lessons that she learned. And here's a couple of the takeaways I had. I love what she has to say about clarity. Also, what she talks about when she is explaining when everything falls apart and what to do when that happens. And I also loved what she shared about having confidence in your unique skill set and gifts. And then next week, you come back and make sure you listen to part 2. You'll get to hear her other 2 lessons, including the power of community and the truth about fear. So let me tell you quickly about September before we get started. Tembi Secrist is a management consultant, writer, and speaker based in Seattle, Washington. She recently returned from that 14-month trip that I just told you about. Previously, September was the director of global healthcare initiatives with the U.S. Commercial Service, the export promotion agency of the U.S. Department of Commerce. She led a global team of 200 responsible for national and international events, education, and healthcare sales. She was with the agency for 16 years and served details as the Deputy National Director and the Advisor for Congressional Outreach. So without further ado, let's jump into our conversation with Tembi Secrist. Welcome to the show. We're so glad to have you with us.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so just for our audience to know a little bit about how you and I met, we actually met when we were both in Costa Rica on a study abroad program during our college years. So we were just commenting that that was like 20 years ago, which is crazy to think about. And over the years, you and I have stayed connected via social media. And that's how I heard about this trip that you just returned from. I remember when you posted about leaving for the trip and just hearing your story of how that all came about. So I wanted to invite you to be on the podcast because I think that you have so much that you could share with our audience about just taking a really big leap of faith and doing something that seems a bit scary. and stepping out and doing something that most of us probably won't ever do. So I'm excited to have you here. So I would love for you just to start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and about your leadership journey.
Sure. Well, thanks again so much for having me on. It's a pleasure and an honor to speak with you and your audience here. My leadership journey really started in a way that I probably wouldn't have expected. I've always stepped up, as a young child and sort of taken on roles because nobody else was doing it. But I didn't necessarily have an end goal in mind that, I want to be in a leadership position or do a lot of these big things. It was just there's a need and I would step into it. So I went to college. I studied business administration, and I really had a heart for missions. My plan was to go after I finished college, be a missionary, be impoverished in the far corners of the world, and didn't really have a plan of going into sort of the corporate government world and taking on some of these leadership roles there. And when I first got my job with the federal government, I honestly thought of it like you might a waitressing job, right? Like, okay, this is something I'll do for a couple years, earn some money, and then I'll quit and go do what I really want to do, which is, go be an impoverished missionary somewhere. And, as part of my story going in there, I was actually kind of confused and frustrated when God kept closing the doors to missions and kept me in government and kept me in government and gave me a lot of success there. I ended up, as you read there, leading a team of 200 people and, just kept climbing and having, projects that went really well and getting a good profile there. And it got to the point where I thought, well, maybe this is just my vocation. Maybe I just meant to stay in this position in leadership. And, this call was something that God had put on my heart as a way to give me a missions heart for where I'm at. But this path has clearly opened up in front of me, and I had to learn to be content there and do the best with what I have, which I know sounds really odd because a lot of people, a job like that is sort of like the end of what a lot of people are looking for. But for me, it took a while to get there. Realize, okay, I guess this is where God wants me, and it'll be okay. But because of that experience, I learned so much about leadership and organization and management that I probably wouldn't have had that opportunity to learn in any other way. So as far as how I got there, it was kind of an accident, but definitely God leading the entire way up there. And he had a good reason for it.
That's awesome.
You sound like a lot of our listeners, Tembi. It sounds like you kind of just followed the path that was in front of you and didn't necessarily seek out leadership. I'm wondering, along that path, when did you actually internalize that you were a leader? When did you realize that you, in fact, were maybe made for this?
I think it comes slowly when, again, you find things that just need to be done, somebody that needs to step up. And for me, I think I've always had a lot of strong opinions. So if somebody wants to know what should we do in this situation, well, I have an idea for you. And sometimes it's just the person with the strongest opinion that people say, well, if you think that's the way it ought to be done, go do it. Okay. So, a big thing that I learned about stepping in initially into leadership is you're not leading anything if people aren't following. So the relationship part of it, building those relationships, creating a team. For me, I think when it really clicked, when I was especially at my job with the Commerce Department, I had two different people on two different occasions tell me I would follow you into battle. And that meant a whole lot, right? Where,
Wow.
there's just this deep level of trust and that they knew that I was willing to fight battles on their behalf and, willing to take the hits and to, get into the uncomfortable, sometimes conflict situations because it would benefit my team. And for me, that was just that point of, okay, there's this trust there, these people that are willing to follow my vision and where I see us going together. And that was kind of a moment that really clicked of maybe this whole thing is working out.
I love that. That's so amazing. So, as I shared at the beginning, you recently returned from a 14-month trip and you volunteered your time in lots of different places, lots of different projects and missions. So, I would love to know what led up to you deciding to leave a very successful career and kind of you were in a position of leadership and had a lot going well for you, right? And you just left everything. So tell us what led up to you deciding to go on that journey.
It was actually pretty unexpected. I had been asked to go to Washington, D.C. and do a detail as the deputy national director. And it was a great opportunity to, be with other leaders of our agency and learn a lot. And I was feeling pretty good about myself, right? I had, all these opportunities in front of me. And I distinctly remember one day I was walking down the halls of the Department of Commerce in Washington, D.C., and my heels were clicking on the marble hallways, and I'm in my cute little suit. And I heard God's voice saying, "You need to move forward and not backwards." And I knew at that moment that it was a shift. It wasn't moving forward in the direction I was going, it was moving forward in a different direction. And it took me a couple of days to really internalize what that meant. And what God was calling me to do. It wasn't something I had planned for or saved money for years and years. It was that moment of, okay, why am I here? Why has God brought me to this place? Why have I learned all of these management and leadership principles? And what am I going to do with it? And it comes down to when the why becomes the why, right? WHY becomes the why in the road, where you have to take one way or another way. And that's a scary point. After a few days, I said, okay, I think this is really what God said. And so I told my boss, I think I'm leaving. And I kind of said it like that. And he said, you're quitting? And it wasn't until I said, yes, I am, that it really clicked in my mind of, oh my gosh, I'm quitting. I never quit a job in my life, right? This is the first job I got out of college. And it was one of those of, what have I just done? But I gave my 2 weeks notice. I flew back to Seattle, kind of wrapped up everything after a 16-year career, packed up my house. It wasn't one of these clear, I know exactly what this is going to look like. The why was sort of the beginning point where I said, okay, God, I know that you are calling me to something. And this idea of this missions call that I mentioned earlier that sort of had been in my life since I was a child just came back. So I started just reaching out to people that I knew, saying, hey, do you know of people that I can connect with? It just sort of came together kind of at the last minute without a whole lot of planning on my part. So I stepped into it, and so many adventures on the way, but it was one of those, it really was hearing God's voice, stepping out without really knowing what that meant at the time, but trusting that God is going to take me through.
Wow, I love that story. And I love how it feels like you acted so quickly. I mean, within a matter of days, you were quitting your job. When you look back now, does that just seem crazy?
Oh my God. I mean, not even look back, or even now when I think about it, right? Like, really, what were you thinking? And honestly, for a long time, it was the double. I was trusting God. I was excited for the adventure. But daily, I was asking myself, what on earth have I done? What have I done? Was this a terrible idea? Did I hear right? It wasn't one of those just peace and calm and, trusting God in everything. It was kind of that dual battle of, there's the logic side. How am I going to pay for things? How am I going to pay for this trip? It wasn't something that, that I had all figured out, but something that I've realized and that God has just confirmed to me again and again is that clarity comes in movement. And, kind of the second, real piece that I took out of this is sometimes you just have to take the first step. A lot of people, I think, are waiting for everything to be figured out, for the plan to be unfurled in front of them. They know exactly what the next step is, what it will look like. And I found in life and in leadership That almost never happens. You have a vague idea, right, of what it might look like. You take the first step and it looks nothing like you thought it would, right? But it's good. And when you start moving, that clarity comes in movement. When the Bible talks about as you are going and, as you are fulfilling what God has put on your life, the next step is it comes when you need it, exactly, and not usually before, because where's the fun in that, right? If you know everything is going to work out okay and you'll actually survive 14 months of solo travel through the far reaches of the world. It's a little bit of the am I going to make it that makes it so much fun, right?
I love that. So I know there's so much you could share with us, Tembi, about this trip, and I would love to just sit down and hear like every single story that you have. But I know you have some leadership principles that you learned along the way. So would you be willing to share with us what some of those lessons are that you learned during this trip that you took?
Sure. So, I think that the first of just taking the first step. One of the stories that I share often about my journey is that even when you step out, it doesn't all come together at the right time. So I quit my job, I packed up my house, and I planned to sell my house. And I thought, okay, that's how I'm going to fund my trip, right? I bought my house in Seattle many years ago. I got a little bit of equity in there, no problem, because I hadn't saved up for years for this trip. I hadn't, got done fundraising. I'm not with an organization. And at that time, Seattle had been the hottest real estate market in the country for like 4 years, right? Houses were selling in a weekend, multiple offers. I'm like, okay, no problem. This is how God is going to confirm and bless, and it's all going to work out. I had great faith, right? I'm like, God, you're going to make my house sell for so much money and all this stuff. And so 6 days after I returned from DC, I put my house on the market and it doesn't sell. And it doesn't sell. And it doesn't sell. And I'm thinking, God, what's going on? I thought this was going to be my big confirmation, right? And, at the end of August, it's been on the market for 2 months. We've lowered the price. We've done everything. I'm working with a good agent, all of that stuff. All the reports start coming out that the market has slowed and inventory has quadrupled and none of the houses are moving. And I'm just thinking, what am I going to do? How am I going to do this? But in my heart, I just started feeling this anxiousness of I have to go, right? I can't just wait until this sells. God has called me to go. So I thought, okay, I'll rent it out, at least, cover the mortgage and we'll take off. So I asked a friend of mine who was in property management if she would find a renter. She said, no problem. So I took off, went to my first destination in the Philippines. September, my house didn't rent. October, my house didn't rent. And I'm starting to get a little desperate here, right? I'm like, okay, God, I have a little bit of money saved up, but if my mortgage isn't covered, I'm not going to be able to stay out here very long. What's going on? Did I hear you wrong? Are you faithful? You start having some of these questions there. And it was the middle of November. So we're getting, pretty far in here. And I'm getting desperate. I'm praying, God, what are you doing with this? And I heard him say, who are you trusting for your provision? Are you trusting your house to provide for you? Or are you trusting me? You
Wow.
got me.
Oh no.
So I had to repent of that. My God, I had my own plan about how I thought I was going to fund this. I had my own plan, about how I was going to cover my expenses, but you are my provider. And if my house doesn't rent out and you've called me to this journey, I trust you to provide in the way that you see fit. So I put that before God and just said, okay, I trust you. And the next day I got a text from my property manager saying the house had rented out. We covered the mortgage. We're okay. Oh, thank you, God. But it was just that, that continual faith. And I think another principle that I've learned through this is you never make it with faith, right? The whole point of faith is that God is always stretching you. And when you make it to one thing, leaving your job, leaving your country, leaving everything you knew, you're not done yet, right? God is always taking you to that next level of, but do you still trust me? Do you still trust that I can provide in this next area? And that was a huge thing that I'm still learning. But that he just demonstrated again his faithfulness throughout all of these situations. Even understanding the different organizations that I was supposed to work with. So sort of the understanding what your biggest value is, right? So I think in a lot of leadership areas, we tend to grasp onto the next thing that's in front of us, which sometimes is good and sometimes you have to do. One time I was, sort of looking for the next project. Things had fallen apart. I wasn't sure what I was going to do next. Somebody asked if I could train on log frames. I had no idea what log frames were, right? But I said, sure, that sounds great. If you need training on log frames, I can do that. As I'm furiously Googling what are log frames, right? And Google comes up and it's a USAID framework for a lot of grants that come through. And I'm looking at that and I'm like, it's government, it's bureaucracy. I know that. Sure, I can train on it. And so sometimes you have to take that step of the opportunity that's in front of you. And then I learned it. I trained on it. I made sure I was an expert before I taught it. But sometimes you also have to recognize where your best return on investment is, where your best value proposition is. And so looking at from the leadership side, what is it that we are created to do? And understanding the contribution that you can make and where other people can make better contributions is another thing that I really had to learn in my journey there. So when I started out, I sent all these emails out to these different organizations. I have this professional background with leadership and management. I have a certification in teaching English as a second language from college 20 years ago, but I still speak English, so I could probably figure it out somewhere. Just kind of offered all of these different things. And the first place I went was the Philippines. And I was working with an orphanage there, and they had new leadership in. So we were looking at some of their policies and their procedures and put together a great advocacy campaign to help them target encouraging the government in the Philippines to streamline adoptions much more quickly. And I was there with another gal who had some expertise, and we were putting together this great plan. And in the middle of it, one of their social workers said, we have an inspection coming up and we really need someone to organize the library. And, I'm usually up for anything, and my heart was up for anything. Whatever you need, I'm happy to do it. But as we were putting these books in order, I just had this check in my spirit of this is not the best use of our abilities here. This is something that, the kids could frankly do. And God brought us here for a specific reason. And we need to be faithful to what God has called us to do as leaders, as people in mission work, while having the heart to do what's needed and, not despising, some of those smaller things that need to be done, but recognizing the giftings that God has given you and functioning in that, not just doing anything at any time for anyone. So, we finished up as best as we could, and, we didn't want to leave a job not finished. But after that, it gave me much more courage to say, my time would be better spent where I have expertise and where I have background. And just that experience really helped shape the rest of my journey as well.
Yeah, I love that. That idea of identifying where you can make the biggest contribution is so huge for all of us, no matter where we're at. And a lot of times we just say yes to jobs that somebody else could honestly do, and we could actually contribute a lot better in another role. So that's a great reminder.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
What are some of the other lessons that you learned, Tembi?
So many in so many different areas. I'll go back to the greatest adventure that you have sometimes starts with a little bit of the unknown, and taking that first step, even if you have to shut your eyes. But the second part of that is knowing that things will probably fall apart in the middle of it. And that's okay. Right. And I think anyone who's lived life at any point realizes that it's not a straight line. But before I left the US, I had an itinerary set up right throughout Southeast Asia and Africa. I had contacts everywhere. Again, that was a huge confirmation for me that gave me courage of, okay, I've got a plan. I can leave the US. I've got places to go. So I went to the Philippines first, and then I went to Indonesia. And when I was in Indonesia, I was going to Cambodia next. And I had been in contact with this gal in Cambodia, I'd filled out an application to work with her organization. I planned to be there for a month, and this was all set up before I left the US. So about 3 weeks ahead of time, I send her an email just to confirm. And I get an email back from her saying, "Oh, I'm sorry. I've left Cambodia. I've gone back to the US. I don't think I'll be returning." And
Oh
I'm
boy.
thinking, were you going to tell me this? Right? I'm on my way to work with you for a month in 3 weeks. Now what? Now what? Right? Same thing. I was supposed to go to Thailand after that. And I'd been in contact with 3 different people. So I thought, okay, these are going pretty well. If one doesn't work out, I've got 2 others that I've been talking with. They all ghosted me all at the same time. And I'm thinking, God, what's going on? Is this, am I supposed to be here? Am I supposed to just go to Africa? And so I start emailing a couple of friends of mine who have some contacts in Cambodia. And this one gal talks to a friend of a friend of a friend, and she sends me an email address. Maybe try her. This is a gal that runs an NGO there, which is a non-governmental organization and international nonprofit. And so I shoot her an email and I go to bed. The next morning, I wake up and I get her email reply. And she said, "You have no idea your timing. Just last night, I was working on my strategic plan and I was getting so frustrated by it. And I prayed, God, I can't do this. You have to help me." And I slammed down my laptop and I went to bed. The next morning, I wake up to your email, which says, in essence, "Hi, I do strategic planning. Do you need any help?" And
Aw.
for me, just that confirmation of, you know, her answer to prayer through my disruption, had my plan worked out the way I thought it was supposed to, I never
Mm.
would have had that contact. She never would have had that answer just when she needed it. I mean, the perfect timing, right? And so I went there with her and we did a strategic plan and we did process documentation and we did, set up systems for HR reviews and just really helped get some policies and processes in place. And I went with her. She was preaching at church on Sunday. And we were at this small local Cambodian church. And I hear an American accent behind me. And there's only Cambodians there. So I turn around and I introduce myself. And there's this guy from Michigan. And he was visiting Cambodia to set up a new ministry, but he was based in Thailand. I said, "Hey, I was looking for some places to serve in Thailand. I do strategy and management. Do you know of anyone that needs some help?" And he looks at me and he raises his hand and he said, "Can you come work with me, please?" And I said, "Sure." And, again, it was, had God not created the space in my schedule by sort of
Mm.
blowing up what I thought I was supposed to do, I never would have had the opportunity to work with these organizations that were perfect, right? It was a perfect fit for my skill set, for what they needed at the right time. They ended up connecting me. His wife is from Myanmar. And so she connected me with some organizations there. So, just trusting that when things fall apart, it still can be part of God's plan that He has for you and such
Mm.
good things that can come from that. But it doesn't mean it's any less scary at the moment, right? When you're out there, you're by yourself, and you're like, "I don't know what I'm going to do." But knowing that, okay, if God has called me and if He's going with me, He's going to provide, He's going to open the right doors, and He's going to make a way. And, that was a huge faith journey, but just knowing that things won't unfold like you think that they're going to, but it's okay. And even through that disruption, that can also be exactly what God had planned for you.
Mm. Oh my word. I love that. I love stories of God's providence and just his timing and his faithfulness
Mhm.
to both you and the people that you coincidentally ran into, right?
Yes, yes. And I think also just some of the trust and the unknowns that come through travel. So, as you can imagine, being a solo female traveler in Southeast Asia and
Mm.
in Africa, you stand out. People can tell that you're not from there. And also realizing that God just puts people in your path when you need them at the right time. When I was taking a flight, and this is one of these stories that just, it's a long story of, things that go wrong and things that fall apart and all these other things, that is just part of travel that happens sometimes. But I was in Bangladesh I had bought this ticket to Sri Lanka, and it was one of these discount tickets, right? And most of these discount tickets, they ding you for luggage and they ding you for these other things. You can only carry on, about 3 or 4 pounds onto the airline. You have to check the rest of your luggage. And, it might be $20, $30 to check your luggage, sometimes $100, but, that's how they make their money. Okay. So I go to check in on this discount airline, and the guy hands me my tickets, and he says, okay, for your luggage, that will be $650. The
Oh
ticket
my
itself was
goodness.
about $200, right? And to check my luggage, and my luggage altogether was 20 pounds each for each one. So they're both carry-on size luggage, pieces of luggage. And I look at him, and I'm like, excuse me? And he's like, sorry about that. It's just what it is. And I'm stressing out. I'm freaking out. Like, I don't have a ton of money to be spending on $650. I wouldn't buy a ticket that cost that much. And so I take my luggage, and I'm stressed out. I'm starting to cry in the airport, right? I don't know what I'm going to do. And there's this gal that comes up. She's probably in her 50s, and she's Belgian. And she's like, are you okay? I'm like, they want to charge me $650 for my luggage. And I'm just crying and telling her. And she's like, oh, these people, they're just crooks. She's like, you just stay with us. And she was traveling with her dad, and he was about 75 years old. And so I pick up my luggage, and her dad is passing out tips everywhere and smiling and making friends. And we just kind of cruise through everything as a crew. Funny thing, if you're traveling in Bangladesh, even if the airline wants to charge you $650 and only allow you to take on one piece of luggage at about 4 pounds, nobody says anything if you take on 3 pieces of luggage at about 50 pounds, if you're with a crew of Belgians. Right. So again, just, at these times when I needed some help, I needed some encouragement, I needed someone to come alongside, God just provided someone. And that happened again and again and again. So, even in the places that wasn't ministry related or necessarily, working in this very spiritual situation, God saw me where I needed some of those additional just support and encouragement in people, and brought them along just at the right time.
I love that. It sounds like God really came through with his network or the body of Christ for you in many, many ways.
Yeah. Well, and I think for me also, one of the big things that brought me joy was realizing the unique skill set that I brought to the body of Christ. Recognizing that God created me uniquely, as he did each one of us, with a specific skill set, with a specific expertise, with a background. So I grew up in a family of people in ministry. My parents are both pastors and missionaries for many years. My brother and his family are missionaries. My great grandfather was a pioneering pastor, coming out west. I always thought I would go into full-time ministry, and God put me in a massive bureaucracy with the federal government. But I'd always grown up around this, right? And so I'm very comfortable working, with missions, with ministry, understanding nonprofit organizations, working with volunteers, some of the unique things that coming maybe straight out of the corporate sector without some of that other exposure may have taken a little bit longer to understand some of those realities. So for each one of us, recognizing that your background, your skill set, your experience is unique, and God is going to use everything that you do, everything that you've experienced as preparation for the next thing. You're never going to arrive. It's always, okay, this that you've gone through, what you've learned, what you've done is preparing you for the next thing, which is also preparation, right? So one of the organizations that I worked with, they were working in these rural areas trying to, increase economic security for some of these village areas. And so they were doing saving circles, which is sort of community lending where everybody saves some money and then you help someone start a small business. Somebody else said, well, as we were going through their strategic plan, my goal is to give 40 cows out to different widows. And we were looking at the strategic plan to help them really organize what they were doing and move to a more effective level. And I was about to write that down as a goal. And I thought back to my own training in strategic planning. And I've been very fortunate to sit through some of these training sessions. At the moment, everybody thinks they're boring and they're like, strategic planning, blah, 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 blah. But at the right moment, it comes back. And I stopped and I really pushed him and I said, is it really about the cows? Is that really your goal? He kind of looked at me and he said, well, that's what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to hand out 40 cows to these widows. And I said, well, what if the cows don't work? Could you use goats? Could you use chickens? Could you, teach sewing? Could you do something else? And he said, oh, yeah, I guess those would work. So my actual goal is economic security, right? And making sure that he had the right goal opened up so many more possibilities for what could have been a failure if the cows didn't work. All of a sudden, all these other options of what success looked like became available. And so, again, looking at how that background, the unique skill set, the unique experiences that God gave me helped me to equip his people, these different organizations, to be better, to be more effective, to raise up to the next level of what they were looking to do as well.
I love that point that you just made about how we are all created uniquely, because that is like a huge part of what we focus on in our podcast, and really
Mm-hmm.
encouraging women to embrace how they are wired and use
Mm-hmm.
their gifts, and that's going to be different for each and every one of us.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious how you balance the tension between being confident in the way God has wired you and how he's gifted you versus having, I think there's sometimes a fear of becoming arrogant or
Mm-hmm.
prideful
Mm-hmm.
and kind of overstepping maybe what God has called us to do. So what are your thoughts on that?
I, I laugh because I had both of those experiences, right? Where, on the one hand, when I said yes to training something where I knew I needed to step out because it was an opportunity to say yes, to stretch myself, to grow. I looked at, I was out in some of these small villages in Malawi and Mozambique, and they really needed entrepreneurship training. And I've never been an entrepreneur. I've worked with hundreds of US entrepreneurs, so I've been around it. But being able to step out and say, I know enough that I can at least get you to the next level. And so putting together a week-long seminar on entrepreneurship and realizing that there is value, and just being able to take some of the lessons learned, sometimes just from being in a country where business works well, and being able to say, these are some principles for success. On the other hand, I went to Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is a challenging, challenging place. The economy is starting to spiral again. Several years ago, they were famous for having like the $50 trillion banknote. The inflation was just massive. So they moved on to the dollar, stabilized their economy, but then they wanted to have their own currency again that supposedly is pegged to the dollar, but they don't want people using the dollar. And so they have this currency that is really just paper. It's not
Mm,
tied to, a Federal Reserve or a bank, and none of the banks have banknotes. You cannot get money in the country. The ATMs are empty. The banks are empty. And so this country is just starting to go into a spiral. I was there for 2 weeks. And when I went into the country, the exchange rate was 10 to 1. 2 weeks later, it was 14 to 1 already. And
mm,
so one of the opportunities I had there was to talk about personal finance at this high school. I tried to caveat it and say, I know things are different here, but here are some principles to keep in mind for when things stabilize eventually. And so I kind of launch into your traditional of, it's important to save and it's important to understand what's an investment. Buying a car isn't a good investment because those depreciate. Buying a house can be considered an investment because those appreciate. Some of these different principles, right, that most of us kind of grow up around that seem like a really good idea. And so I left there, and my host just kind of looks at me and she says, I know you were doing your best, but everything here is completely opposite. She said, because inflation is so
mm.
high, you have to spend your money right away. You can't save it, right? You have to buy something that you can then mark up the value. If you save your money, then it just disappears in inflation. She said houses don't actually hold their value here because there's so much land. It is cheaper for people to build their own house than to buy an existing house. Cars, on the other hand, go up in value because there are such high tariffs here that to import a car is so expensive. It's much cheaper simply to fix up old cars. And so if you want a car, you buy one that's already in the country. So those hold value really well. And it was, I was just feeling so terrible that I led all these poor children astray of all the things that I thought I knew about personal finance. But in an economy like that, it is just so, so different. So, your point of the lack of assumptions and, making sure that you go in with a humility and asking a lot of questions. And that's one thing that I found most people, I think, recognize that you, especially in travel, if you're doing something similar to this, you're not from there, you're not expected to be an expert in everything. So coming in saying, this is what I know, this is what I don't know, with enough confidence to say, but I know that you know how to apply this. You can take the principles and interpret them for how it will work for you locally. And, when I'm giving some of these seminars on entrepreneurship or some of these other topics that I taught on, being able to ask a lot of questions, get feedback. Is this working? Do we need to adjust? Do we need to give a different example? I think really helps you get that balance of, okay, this is effective. Or over here, I have no idea what I'm talking about. we need to adjust course here, right?
Oh my goodness. I hope that you loved this first part of our conversation with Tembi as much as I did. And I hope you laughed right along with us. We had a lot of fun on that conversation. And next week, as I mentioned in the intro, we will be coming back with part 2 of Tembis Story. So in that, you will get to hear the next couple lessons that she has to share with us. So make sure you're subscribed so that you don't miss part 2 of this conversation. I think you're going to love hearing from Tembi and what she learned about the power of other people on her trip, and also how she dealt with some of the fears she faced during her travels, and lots more. I promise you won't want to miss it. So make sure you come back and listen to part 2 next week. In the meantime, I hope to see you inside of our Purposeful Leadership Facebook group, and have a great week. Thanks for joining us on the Christian Women Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, come and join us in our private Facebook community. We would love to get to know you better so that we can make sure the podcast is providing what you need. Plus, you can share your questions and ideas, and you'll be surrounded by incredible Christian women leaders. To join the group, visit estherlittlefield.com/group. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.